That summer, when the sun punished the plains of Campania and the air trembled above the volcanic stone walls, an army marched toward a city that had dared to defy Rome. Legions advanced in tight columns, their armor gleaming like scales of an iron serpent, red standards waving against the blue of the Mediterranean. At their head, a general with cold eyes and limitless ambition already savored victory. For Rome, Pompeii was just another rebellious city that needed to be crushed. But behind those walls, the inhabitants did not tremble. They did not flee. They waited. Men and women who spoke a language older than Latin. Warriors who had learned to fight in the mountains of the Apennines. A people who had faced Rome before and knew the price of freedom. When the first catapult stones tore through the sky and exploded against the defense towers, no one abandoned their post. When the battering rams began hammering the gates, the defenders answered with arrows, stones, and fire. Screams echoed through the narrow streets. Smoke rose in black columns. The smell of blood and burnt bronze filled the hot summer air. For weeks, the battle transformed the walls into a slaughterhouse. Bodies fell on both sides. War machines spewed projectiles that pierced stone like flesh, and when silence finally descended upon the conquered city, the scars of that siege remained forever etched in the stone. 168 years later, when the mountain awoke and buried Pompeii under tons of ash, those marks were still there. Holes in the walls, projectiles buried in the ground, graffiti indicating to the defenders where to gather when the attack came. The mountain preserved not only a Roman city, but the memory of a war the world forgot. The war in which Rome crushed Pompeii for the first time. By the end of the 2nd century before Christ, the Roman Republic already dominated the Mediterranean. Carthage had been reduced to ashes. Greece had been subdued. The kingdoms of the East trembled before the legions. But within Italy itself, an ancient wound remained open. Rome's allies, the peoples who had marched alongside the legions in dozens of wars, who had bled on the same battlefields, who had built the roads and fortresses of the nascent empire, remained excluded. They were not citizens. They had no voice in the Senate. They could not vote in the assemblies. They paid taxes and died in wars, but Rome treated them as servants, not brothers. Among those peoples were the Samnites, a confederation of warrior tribes that dominated the mountains south of Rome. For generations, the Samnites had been the Republic's fiercest rivals. In the Samnite wars of the previous century, they had inflicted upon the Romans one of the most humiliating defeats in their history, at the Caudine Forks, where an entire army was forced to pass under the enemy's yoke. Even subdued, they were never truly tamed. Their language, Oscan, still echoed in the cities of Campania. Their customs still shaped daily life. And in Pompeii, a prosperous port city at the foot of Vesuvius, Samnite culture flourished beneath a thin layer of Roman influence. Pompeii was then a city of perhaps 12,000 souls. Its volcanic stone streets wound between houses painted red and ochre. Its triangular forum held a Doric temple erected centuries before by the Greeks. Merchants brought wines, fabrics, and ceramics from across the Mediterranean. The Sarno River, navigable to the sea, transformed the city into a vital commercial hub. But beneath that prosperity, the same rage that boiled throughout Italy also burned. In Pompeii, in 91 before Christ, the tension finally exploded. A Roman tribune named Marcus Livius Drusus attempted to pass a law that would grant citizenship to all Italic allies. The Senate, dominated by aristocrats who feared losing power, blocked the proposal. Drusus was assassinated shortly after, and with his death died the last hope for a peaceful solution. The allies rose up. The revolt began in Asculum, in central Italy, where Roman citizens were massacred in the streets. Within weeks, the rebellion spread like fire through dry straw. The Marsi, the Paeligni, the Vestini, the Hirpini, and the Samnites declared war on Rome. They created their own republic, with its capital at Corfinium, which they renamed Italia. They minted coins showing a bull, symbol of the Italics, goring a wolf, the sacred animal of Rome. The message was clear: Italia would destroy Rome. Pompeii did not hesitate. Along with Nola, Herculaneum, and other cities of Campania, it joined the revolt. For the first time in generations, Pompeians took up arms not as Rome's auxiliaries, but as declared enemies. Their walls, built centuries before to defend the city from Greek and Etruscan invaders, would now be tested against the legions they had once sworn to protect. The social war, as the Romans would call it, was one of the bloodiest in the Republic's history. In 90 before Christ, the first full year of fighting, the Italic armies achieved devastating victories. In the north, the consul Publius Rutilius Lupus was killed in battle. In the south, the Samnite leader Gaius Papius Mutilus swept through Campania like a storm, capturing Nola, Stabiae, Sorrento, and Salerno. Cities that once paid tribute to Rome now flew the standard of the bull. Rome reacted with fury and pragmatism, while its armies fought to contain the rebellion. The Senate passed the Lex Julia, offering citizenship to all allies who remained loyal or who laid down their arms immediately. It was a belated concession, but effective. Many communities accepted the offer and abandoned the fight. The Italic alliance began to crack, but the Samnites and their most fervent allies refused. To them, the Roman offer was a trap, an empty promise that would be revoked as soon as the threat passed. They continued fighting, even as the tide began to turn against them. In 89 before Christ, Rome sent south a general who would change the course of the war, and eventually of the Republic itself. His name was Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla was then 49 years old. Born into an impoverished patrician family, he had spent his youth in poverty, living in slums and frequenting the company of actors and prostitutes. But beneath that dissolute appearance lurked a brilliant mind and boundless ambition. He had served under the great Marius in the wars against Jugurtha and against the Cimbri, distinguishing himself battle after battle. He had learned the art of war in the arenas of Africa and on the frozen fields of the north. Now, finally, he had his own command. The ancients described Sulla as a man of remarkable appearance, with piercing blue eyes and reddish-blonde hair. His face, they said, was like a mulberry sprinkled with flour, with fair skin mottled by red marks. He spoke Greek and Latin with equal fluency. He loved poetry, wine, and the pleasures of the flesh. But when he donned his armor, he transformed into something different: cold, calculating, ruthless. A man who believed he was favored by the gods, who considered himself touched by Venus herself. When he assumed command of Roman forces in Campania, Sulla found a chaotic situation. Nola remained in Samnite hands. Pompeii and Herculaneum had joined the revolt. Papius Mutilus's army still threatened the region. Sulla had no time for prolonged sieges or wars of attrition. He needed quick and decisive victories. His strategy was simple and brutal. First, he isolated the rebel cities, cutting their supply and communication lines. Then, he attacked the relief armies before they could arrive. Finally, he besieged the cities one by one, cracking them like nuts in a vice. In the spring of 89 before Christ, Sulla established his camp in the hills around Pompeii. From there, he could see the city's walls stretching for more than 3 kilometers, encircling an area of 66 hectares. Watchtowers dotted the perimeter. Massive gates guarded the main entrances. It was a respectable fortress, built over centuries by Oscan, Greek, and Samnite hands. But Sulla could also see its weaknesses. The walls, though solid, had not been designed to withstand modern Roman siege machines. The city depended on the Sarno River for water and trade, and that river could be controlled. And the defenders, however brave they might be, did not have the numbers or resources to resist indefinitely. As he prepared the siege, news arrived that a Samnite army under the command of Lucius Cluentius was marching to relieve the besieged cities. Sulla did not wait. He left part of his forces maintaining pressure on Pompeii and Herculaneum and marched to intercept the enemy near Nola. What followed was a massacre. Cluentius camped less than a kilometer from Roman positions, confident in his numbers. But Sulla attacked before the enemy could organize, launching his legions in a devastating charge. The Samnites fought with the ferocity that had made them famous, but they could not withstand Roman discipline. Cluentius was killed beneath the walls of Nola, his army torn apart. 18,000 Italics, according to some sources, lay on the field when the sun set. With the threat of relief eliminated, Sulla turned his full attention to the besieged cities. Herculaneum fell first on June 11th. The small coastal town had no way to resist the victorious legions. Its defenders were killed or enslaved, its riches plundered. Now it was Pompeii's turn. The siege of Pompeii was different. The city was larger, its walls stronger, its defenders more numerous and determined. Sulla could not simply storm it, as he had done with Herculaneum. He would need patience, he would need war machines, he would need to break the defenders' will before he broke their walls. The Romans established a complete perimeter around the city, cutting off all routes in and out. No food entered, no reinforcements arrived, no hope came from outside. Within the walls, the Pompeians watched the noose tighten around their neck. Then came the machines. Catapults were positioned at strategic points, capable of hurling stones weighing dozens of kilograms over the walls. Ballistae fired metal projectiles that pierced shields and armor. Siege towers, massive wooden structures covered in wet leather to resist fire, were erected to allow Romans to fight at the same level as the defenders. Battering rams were mounted beneath protective sheds called tortoises, ready to hammer the gates until they gave way. The bombardment began. Day after day, stones rained upon Pompeii. Houses collapsed, temples were struck. The constant sound of impacts echoed through the narrow streets, an artificial thunder that never ceased. At night, the Pompeians worked frantically to repair the damage, piling stones and earth at the weakest points of the walls. At dawn, the Romans resumed the bombardment, undoing in hours the work of an entire night. The defenders resisted as best they could. Archers in the towers fired at any Roman who came too close. Cauldrons of boiling water and oil were poured on those who tried to scale the walls. Night sorties attempted to destroy the siege machines, sometimes with success, more often ending in carnage. The Pompeians knew they were outmatched, but they fought anyway. They fought because it was all they had left. Graffiti on the walls, discovered centuries later by archaeologists, reveal fragments of that desperate resistance. Inscriptions in Oscan indicated rally points for the defenders, places where they should concentrate when the Romans attacked a particular sector. They were the last words of a people determined not to surrender. But determination could not replace food, water, and reinforcements. Weeks passed. Supplies within the city dwindled. The wounded accumulated without enough medicine to treat them. The dead were buried in increasingly shallow graves, as there was neither time nor energy for deep excavations. And the Romans continued, patient, inexorable, knowing time was on their side. Sulla was in no hurry. He personally supervised the siege, walking among the lines, checking the positions of the machines, conversing with his centurions. One of his legates, a former consul named Postumius Albinus, became so unpopular among the soldiers that he was stoned to death by his own troops. Sulla refused to punish the killers. Instead, he declared that the Roman blood spilled would be expiated with the enemy's blood. It was a clear message. The only path to redemption was victory. At one point, before one of the battles, a strange incident occurred. While Sulla was offering sacrifices in front of his headquarters near Nola, a snake emerged from beneath the altar. A soothsayer named Gaius Postumius implored the general to advance immediately. Sulla obeyed and captured a heavily fortified Samnite camp. To him, it was further proof that the gods favored him, that his destiny was to triumph. Meanwhile, inside Pompeii, the situation deteriorated. Food had run out. People ate rats, dogs, anything that could be swallowed. Potable water had become scarce, contaminated by corpses and waste. Diseases began to spread. The weakest died first, the very young and the very old, but soon the warriors themselves began to fall, weakened by hunger before they could even be wounded in combat. The elders of the city must have gathered at some point during those final weeks. We have no record of what was said, but we can imagine the debate. Some still wanted to fight, preferring death to surrender. Others argued that further resistance would only prolong suffering without changing the outcome. Children were dying. Women wept for the children they could not feed. To continue was to condemn the entire population to extinction. In the end, the decision was made. Pompeii would surrender. We do not know exactly how the city fell. The ancient records are fragmentary, more concerned with great battles than prolonged sieges. We only know that at some point after June 11th of 89 before Christ, Pompeii opened its gates to the Romans. What followed was the common fate of conquered cities. The leaders of the revolt were executed or sold into slavery. Properties were confiscated. The city was stripped of its autonomy and transformed into Roman territory. But unlike other rebel cities that were razed, Pompeii was spared total destruction. Sulla had plans for it. 10 years later, in 80 before Christ, Sulla, now dictator of Rome, sent a colony of his veterans to Pompeii. Nearly 2,000 retired soldiers, men who had fought at his side in dozens of battles, received land and houses in the conquered city. They brought their families, their slaves, their Roman customs. Sulla's nephew, Publius Sulla, was named patron of the new colony. The transformation was swift and complete. Latin replaced Oscan as the official language. Public inscriptions came to be carved in Roman characters. Temples were reconsecrated to Roman gods. The original elite of Pompeii, the descendants of the ancient Samnite families, was gradually replaced by veterans and their heirs. Within a generation, the city that had fought so fiercely for its independence became indistinguishable from any other Roman city. But the scars remained. When archaeologists began excavating Pompeii in the 18th century, they found something unexpected. The city's walls were riddled with holes, marks left by Roman siege machines nearly 2,000 years before. Catapult projectiles were discovered buried in the ground, exactly where they had fallen in that summer of 89 before Christ. Oscan graffiti was still legible on some walls, last messages of a people long since ceased to exist. Vesuvius, by burying the city, preserved not only Roman daily life from 79 after Christ, but also the memories of a war the world had forgotten. A war fought 168 years before the eruption, when Pompeii was not yet Roman, when its inhabitants still spoke the language of their ancestors, when they still dreamed of freedom. The social war officially ended in 88 before Christ, when the last pockets of resistance were eliminated. Rome won on the battlefield, but in a way, the Allies also won. Roman citizenship was gradually extended to all the peoples of Italy, exactly what the rebels had demanded from the beginning. The irony was bitter. They obtained in defeat what had been denied them in peace. For the Samnites, however, history would have a darker ending. They continued fighting, refusing to accept Roman peace, even when the war was clearly lost. They allied with Sulla's enemies during the civil wars that followed. And when Sulla finally triumphed at the Battle of the Colline Gate in 82 before Christ, his vengeance was terrible. Thousands of Samnite prisoners were massacred. Their lands were devastated, their cities razed. The people who had been Rome's greatest rivals were practically exterminated. Sulla died in 78 before Christ at his villa in Puteoli, not far from Pompeii. They say he spent his final years drinking, writing his memoirs, and entertaining actors and musicians. He died in peace, one of the few Roman dictators to voluntarily relinquish power and pass away from natural causes. He believed until the end that the gods had favored him, that his luck was a sign of divine approval. Pompeii prospered under Roman rule. New constructions arose, including a great amphitheater, one of the first in the Roman world, built around 70 before Christ. The city became a vacation destination for Rome's elite, attracted by the mild climate, the thermal waters, and the local wines. The descendants of Sulla's veterans gradually mixed with the remnants of the original population, and over time, no one remembered the war that had transformed an Oscan city into a Roman colony. But the stones remembered. When Vesuvius awoke on August 24th of 79 after Christ, Pompeii was a city of perhaps 20,000 inhabitants, Romans mostly, speaking Latin, worshipping Roman gods, living Roman lives. Nothing remained of the ancient Oscan culture beyond some forgotten inscriptions and the scars on the walls that no one noticed anymore. The eruption lasted 2 days. First came the rain of pumice and ash, which buried the city under meters of debris. Then came the pyroclastic flows, waves of superheated gas and pulverized rock that swept through the streets at impossible speeds, instantly killing any living thing in their path. When Vesuvius finally calmed, Pompeii had vanished, buried beneath a shroud of ash, forgotten for centuries. It was that burial that preserved the memory of the forgotten war. The holes in the walls, the projectiles in the ground, the defenders' graffiti, all survived because they were sealed beneath the ash before time, and men could erase them. When archaeologists finally unearthed the city, they found not only a snapshot of Roman life, but also the ghosts of a conflict far more ancient. Today, visitors to Pompeii walk the same streets Sulla traversed as a conqueror, pass through the same gates his soldiers forced, touch the same stones that still bear the marks of the siege. Most do not know what they are seeing. To them, Pompeii is a Roman city destroyed by a volcano, nothing more. But for those who know the history, each hole in the wall tells a different story. A story of resistance and defeat, of lost freedom and erased identity, of a people who fought against destiny and lost. The story no one remembers, the story of how Rome crushed Pompeii before Vesuvius could. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell. Rome fell. Europe sank into darkness and then was reborn. Men walked on the moon, and still the scars remain. Not in Pompeii's walls alone, but in the very fabric of Western civilization. The Romans who conquered Pompeii would build an empire that would shape human history. The language they imposed on the Pompeians would evolve into Italian, Spanish, French, Portuguese. The laws they wrote still underpin the legal systems of half the world. The culture they spread still lives in our architecture, our art, our way of thinking. But all this began with blood, with sieges and battles, with cities that dared to resist and were crushed. Pompeii was not the first, nor the last. It was just one among dozens, hundreds, thousands of communities that were absorbed into the Roman vortex. Some surrendered peacefully, others fought to the end. All eventually became Roman. It is easy to romanticize the past, to see the Romans as builders and civilizers, to forget that their empire was forged with iron and fire. Pompeii reminds us of the truth. The marks on its walls are birth scars, evidence of the trauma that preceded its life as a Roman city. It did not become Roman by choice. It was forced, conquered, transformed against its will. And yet, something survived. The Oscan graffiti, preserved by the same eruption that destroyed the city, are the last words of a people who refused to be forgotten. Even when their language died, even when their gods were replaced, even when their descendants became indistinguishable from any other Roman, those inscriptions remained, waiting for the day when someone would find them and remember. Perhaps that is what history really is. Not the great events everyone knows, but the small details that survive by chance. Not the celebrated victories, but the forgotten defeats. Not the conquerors who write the books, but the conquered who leave marks on the stones. Pompeii teaches us that even the greatest catastrophes can preserve what seemed lost forever. Vesuvius destroyed a city, but saved a memory. The memory of a war no one remembers. The memory of a people who fought and lost. The memory that, long before the eruption that would make it famous, Pompeii had already been crushed once, and perhaps if we pay attention, if we look beyond the Roman ruins and search for the older scars, we can still hear the echoes of that battle. The thunder of the catapults, the cry of the defenders, the silence that came after, the silence of the vanquished, the silence that lasted 168 years until Vesuvius sealed it forever.